My name is Jake Razor Sullivan, and I spent 12 years as a patch-wearing member of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. For over a decade, I believed the violence that plagued the biker world was random chaos, territorial disputes that erupted naturally between rival clubs. I thought we were fighting for respect, for patches, for the right to call ourselves the kings of the road. But I was wrong. Dead wrong. There was a puppet master pulling the strings, orchestrating every major conflict, every bloody war that tore through the motorcycle club scene from California to New York. His name was Tommy Rodriguez, and this is the story of how one man turned the entire American biker underworld into his personal chess game. I prospected for the Angels in 2009, fresh out of a 3-year stint in Lompoc Federal Prison for assault with a deadly weapon. I was 28, angry at the world, and looking for a brotherhood that would accept my rage and give it purpose. The Angels offered exactly that, a family bound by loyalty, violence, and the roar of Harley-Davidson engines. My sponsor was a guy called Bones Martinez, a 20-year veteran who ran with the Oakland chapter during the club's most violent period in the 1980s. Bones taught me the rules, the hierarchy, the code that governed our world. Never rat, never back down, never show weakness, he'd say, while we worked on bikes in his garage. The moment you break any of those rules, you're not just dead to the club, you're dead, period. The first few years were everything I expected. Bar fights, drug runs, intimidation jobs for local businesses that needed problems solved quietly. We were criminals, but we were criminals with a code. There was honor in the violence, purpose in the chaos. When we fought the Mongols or the Bandidos, it was over real grievances. Someone disrespected our colors, moved drugs in our territory, or insulted a brother's old lady. But around 2012, things started changing in ways that didn't make sense. Conflicts that should have been settled with fists began escalating to gunfire. Minor territorial disputes turned into multi-state wars. Clubs that had coexisted peacefully for decades suddenly found themselves in bloody feuds that seemed to come out of nowhere. The first sign something was different came during a meeting in Riverside in March 2013. Our chapter president, Big Mike Torres, was briefing us on a conflict brewing with the Vagos in Nevada. According to Mike, the Vagos had been encroaching on methamphetamine distribution routes that belonged to us, and we needed to send a message. Word came down from up top, Mike told the assembled brothers. This isn't just about Nevada anymore. The Vagos are making moves in Arizona, Colorado, even talking about setting up chapters in Texas. If we don't hit them hard now, they'll think they can walk all over us anywhere. Something about the briefing felt off. I'd been running meth for the club for 2 years, and I knew our distribution network better than most. The routes the Vagos allegedly threatened weren't even profitable ones. They were secondary markets, places where we moved maybe £20 a month on a good month. It didn't make strategic sense for the Vagos to risk a war over such small potatoes, but orders were orders. 2 weeks later, I was part of a 15-man crew that rode to Las Vegas to handle the situation. The plan was to hit a Vagos clubhouse during their weekly church meeting, send a message that would make them think twice about expanding into our territory. We arrived at the clubhouse on a Tuesday night, expecting to find maybe 8 or 10 Vagos inside. Instead, we rolled up on what looked like a family barbecue. There were women and children in the parking lot, prospects washing bikes, old-timers playing cards on picnic tables. It was hardly the strategic methamphetamine summit we'd been told to expect. The violence that followed was brutal and unnecessary. When the shooting started, civilians ran for cover behind cars while we traded gunfire with Vagos, who were protecting their families rather than their drug routes. 3 people died that night, 2 Vagos and 1 of our prospects, a kid named Danny, who took a shotgun blast to the chest while trying to cover our retreat. Driving back to California with Danny's blood still on my jacket, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd been set up for a conflict that served no real purpose. The Vagos weren't expanding into our territory, they weren't threatening our business, and they sure as hell weren't the strategic threat we'd been told they represented. That's when I first heard the name Tommy Rodriguez whispered, in the kind of hushed tones usually reserved for discussing federal indictments or club traitors. Rodriguez wasn't a Hells Angel. He wasn't a Vago, Mongol, Bandido, or member of any club most people would recognize. He was something much more dangerous, a freelance orchestrator who worked in the shadows of the outlaw motorcycle world. manipulating conflicts for profit and power. The first detailed information about Rodriguez came from an unlikely source, Maria Sandoval, a former old lady of a Vagos sergeant-at-arms named Crusher Williams. Maria had been around the club scene for 15 years, smart enough to keep her mouth shut and her ears open. When Crusher died in a motorcycle accident in 2014, Maria found herself on the outside looking in, no longer protected by Patch but still carrying secrets that could destroy lives. I met Maria at a dive bar in Barstow, a neutral territory where bikers from different clubs occasionally crossed paths without bloodshed. She was working as a bartender, trying to build a straight life away from the violence that had defined her 20s and 30s. But Maria carried information that ate at her, knowledge about how the wars that killed her friends and lovers weren't random acts of territorial aggression. "You want to know why Crusher really died?" she asked me during one of our conversations. It wasn't no accident. He was getting too close to figuring out who was feeding information to different clubs, who was stirring up conflicts that didn't need to happen. According to Maria, Crusher had noticed the same patterns that were bothering me, conflicts that erupted without warning, intelligence about rival clubs that seemed too detailed and too timely, wars that benefited nobody except gun dealers and funeral homes. Maria told me about meetings Crusher had described, gatherings that happened in neutral locations like truck stops and Indian casinos, where representatives from supposedly rival clubs would sit down with a man they called the coordinator. Crusher never saw these meetings directly, but he heard enough second-hand information to piece together a disturbing picture. The coordinator was Tommy Rodriguez, a former Marine intelligence officer who'd been dishonorably discharged for selling weapons to Mexican cartels. After his military career ended, Rodriguez had found a new calling in the outlaw motorcycle world, manufacturing conflicts that served his financial interests. Rodriguez's operation was sophisticated and profitable. He would identify tensions between clubs, then feed information to both sides designed to escalate minor disputes into major wars. He sold intelligence about rival club activities, weapons for the conflicts he created, and even offered strategic consulting, services to clubs that wanted to expand their territory or eliminate competition. The genius of Rodriguez's system was that nobody saw the whole picture. Individual club members knew only their piece of the puzzle, a tip about rival club movements, an opportunity to buy military-grade weapons at discount prices, intelligence about law enforcement operations that might interfere with their business. Rodriguez made himself indispensable to multiple organizations while ensuring that none of them understood how they were being manipulated. Maria's information led me to start paying closer attention to the patterns of violence in the biker world. I began documenting conflicts, mapping their progression, looking for connections that weren't immediately obvious. What I discovered was a web of orchestrated chaos that stretched across the entire country. The Waco shootout in May 2015 was the most visible example of Rodriguez's handiwork. 9 bikers died, and 18 were wounded in a massive brawl at a Twin Peaks restaurant that was supposed to be a peaceful meeting of the Texas Confederation of Clubs and Independents. The media portrayed it as spontaneous violence between rival gangs, but the reality was much more calculated. 3 weeks before Waco, Rodriguez had fed information to the bandidos suggesting that the Cossacks were planning to challenge their dominance in Texas by making a show of force at the Confederation meeting. Simultaneously, he told the Cossacks that the bandidos were planning to use the meeting to announce new territorial restrictions that would effectively shut down smaller clubs. Neither piece of information was true, but both were plausible enough to create the paranoia and preparation that turned a routine political meeting into a battlefield. Rodriguez didn't pull any triggers in Waco, but he loaded the guns and pointed them at targets he'd carefully selected. The aftermath of Waco was exactly what Rodriguez had predicted and planned for. Massive law enforcement crackdowns that disrupted established drug distribution networks, creating opportunities for new players to enter profitable markets. Rodriguez had positioned himself to broker introductions between Mexican cartels and the survivors of biker clubs that needed new revenue streams to replace what they'd lost to arrests and prosecutions. My investigation into Rodriguez's activities put me in dangerous territory. I was asking questions that loyal Hells Angels weren't supposed to ask, showing interest in information that could be interpreted as preparation for ratting out the club. But I couldn't stop digging because every piece of evidence I found revealed more manipulation, more unnecessary violence, more deaths that served no purpose except Rodriguez's profit margins. The breakthrough came in September 2015 when I was approached by a prospect from the Iron Order Motorcycle Club, a group that wore patches but maintained they were a family club rather than a criminal organization. The prospect, who called himself Diesel, had information about Rodriguez that he wanted to trade for protection from retaliation. According to Diesel, the Iron Order had been approached by Rodriguez in 2014 with an offer to help them expand into traditional outlaw club territory. Rodriguez promised intelligence about rival club activities, weapons for protection, and strategic advice about how to establish chapters in cities controlled by the Angels, Bandidos, and other major clubs. The Iron Order leadership had been suspicious of Rodriguez's offer, especially when they realized he was making similar pitches to clubs that would naturally come into conflict with Iron Order expansion plans. But some members had accepted Rodriguez's assistance, and Diesel had documentation of payments, weapon transfers, and intelligence briefings that revealed the scope of Rodriguez's operation. Diesel's evidence included bank records showing payments from Rodriguez to Iron Order, members totaling over $200,000, along with receipts for weapons purchases and copies of intelligence reports about Hell's Angels chapter activities that could only have come from sources inside law enforcement or rival clubs. More disturbing were transcripts of recorded conversations between Rodriguez and Iron Order members, where he explicitly discussed his strategy of creating conflicts between established clubs that would weaken their control over profitable territories. Rodriguez talked about the biker world like a military campaign, with clubs as opposing armies that could be maneuvered into destroying each other while he profited from the chaos. The beauty of this community, Rodriguez said in one recorded conversation, is that everyone thinks they're warriors fighting for honor and respect. They don't realize they're just pieces on a game board, and I'm the one moving the pieces. Armed with Diesel's evidence and my own research, I made a decision that violated every rule of the outlaw motorcycle world. I was going to expose Rodriguez's operation, even if it meant burning bridges with my own club. I started by approaching individual members from different chapters, sharing information about Rodriguez's manipulation without revealing how I'd obtained it. The response was predictably mixed. Some brothers dismissed it as conspiracy theories, others suspected I was working with law enforcement, and a few quietly admitted they'd noticed the same patterns I was documenting. The most important ally I found was Gunnar Morrison, a sergeant-at-arms from the Oakland chapter, who'd been questioning the strategic value of recent conflicts. Gunnar was old-school Angels, someone who'd earned his patch through violence, but wasn't interested in violence that served no purpose. Together, Gunnar and I began building a case against Rodriguez that could be presented to national leadership. We documented payments, traced weapons, mapped conflicts, and identified club members who had accepted Rodriguez's assistance without understanding his larger agenda. Our investigation revealed that Rodriguez had been operating his manipulation scheme for over 5 years, orchestrating conflicts that resulted in dozens of deaths and hundreds of arrests. He'd profited from weapons sales, drug trafficking introductions, and consulting fees, while the biker community tore itself apart following his choreographed scripts. The most personal revelation came when we discovered that Rodriguez had orchestrated the conflict that led to Danny's death in Las Vegas. The intelligence about Vegas expansion that triggered our raid had come directly from Rodriguez, who was simultaneously selling weapons to the Vagos and feeding information to law enforcement about both clubs' activities. Danny died because Rodriguez needed a dramatic escalation between the Angels and Vagos to justify weapons sales and create opportunities for his cartel contacts to move into disrupted drug markets. 19-year-old kid who wanted nothing more than to earn his patch and ride with his brothers was sacrificed for Rodriguez's profit margins. In January 2016, Gunnar and I requested a meeting with the club's national leadership to present our findings about Rodriguez's operation. The meeting took place in a warehouse outside of Phoenix, with representatives from major chapters across the country in attendance. The presentation was received with skepticism and anger. Some members accused us of working with law enforcement. Others suggested we were trying to deflect responsibility for our own failures by blaming outside manipulation. But the evidence was compelling enough that national leadership authorized a limited investigation into Rodriguez's activities. What they found confirmed our worst fears. Rodriguez had cultivated sources inside multiple clubs, bribed prospects to provide intelligence, and even recruited law enforcement officers to feed him information about upcoming raids and investigations. He'd turned the entire outlaw motorcycle community into his personal intelligence network, using their trust and loyalty against them. The decision to eliminate Rodriguez was made in March 2016, during a closed meeting of national leadership that Gunnar and I were not permitted to attend. We were told only that the problem would be handled and that we should forget everything we'd learned about Rodriguez's operation. Rodriguez disappeared in April 2016. Officially, he simply stopped showing up at his usual haunts, stopped returning phone calls, stopped orchestrating conflicts. His apartment in Las Vegas was found empty, his bank accounts closed, his phone numbers disconnected. Whether he was killed, fled the country, or entered witness protection remains unknown. What I do know is that the pattern of orchestrated conflicts stopped with Rodriguez's disappearance. The biker wars that had raged across America for 4 years ended almost overnight, replaced by the kind of localized disputes that could be traced to real grievances rather than manufactured intelligence. But the damage Rodriguez had done couldn't be undone. Hundreds of bikers had died in conflicts he orchestrated. Thousands had been arrested in the law enforcement crackdowns that followed his manufactured wars, and the entire outlaw motorcycle community had been weakened by fighting shadows instead of real enemies. My involvement in exposing Rodriguez ended my career with the Hells Angels. In July 2016, I was voted out of the club for conduct unbecoming a member, a decision that meant turning in my patch and cutting all ties with the brotherhood that had defined my adult life. The official reason given for my expulsion was that I had violated club security by investigating Rodriguez without authorization from leadership. The real reason was that I had forced the club to confront uncomfortable truths about how easily they'd been manipulated, how their legendary intelligence network had been penetrated, and how their most sacred wars had been choreographed by an outsider. Leaving the Angels meant leaving behind not just a social circle, but an entire identity. I was no longer Razor, the fearless Hell's Angel who commanded respect through violence and loyalty. I was just Jake Sullivan, a 45-year-old ex-convict with limited job prospects and a reputation for causing trouble. The transition to civilian life was harder than any prison sentence I'd served. In prison, you know the rules, you understand the power structure. You can navigate the violence because it follows predictable patterns. In the straight world, everything is negotiations and compromises, bureaucracy and social niceties that feel foreign after decades in the outlaw community. But civilian life also offered something I hadn't experienced since my early 20s, the freedom to make choices based on conscience rather than loyalty to an organization. For the first time in my adult life, I could speak truth without worrying about how it affected club business, investigate suspicious activity without permission from leadership, and form relationships based on mutual respect rather than hierarchical obligation. In 2018, I was contacted by a documentary filmmaker who was investigating the role of outside agitators in biker conflicts. I agreed to participate, sharing my story about Rodriguez's operation and its impact on the motorcycle club community. The documentary was never completed due to legal threats from multiple sources, but the process of telling my story helped me understand the broader implications of what I'd witnessed. Rodriguez's manipulation of the biker community was part of a larger pattern of chaos profiteering that affects many aspects of American society. From defense contractors who benefit from prolonged military conflicts to private prison companies that profit from high incarceration rates, there are always people who make money from problems rather than solutions. The outlaw motorcycle community was particularly vulnerable to Rodriguez's manipulation because of its culture of secrecy, loyalty, and violence. Clubs that prided themselves on independence and self-reliance were easily turned against each other by someone who understood their psychological pressure points and exploited their communication weaknesses. Rodriguez succeeded because he gave each club what they wanted to hear: intelligence that confirmed their suspicions about rivals, opportunities for profitable expansion, validation of their fears about being disrespected or threatened. He never asked anyone to act against their nature, only to act more extremely than they might have otherwise. The lesson I learned from the Rodriguez affair is that loyalty without critical thinking is dangerous, that brotherhood without accountability can be exploited, and that violence without purpose serves only those who profit from chaos. Today, I work as a consultant for law enforcement agencies that want to understand outlaw motorcycle club culture without the prejudices and misconceptions that often guide their investigations. I help them distinguish between legitimate criminal activity and manufactured conflicts, between real threats and imaginary enemies. I also speak to young men who are considering joining outlaw motorcycle clubs, trying to help them understand what they're really signing up for. I don't try to talk them out of it entirely, because for some people the structure and brotherhood of club life provides meaning and purpose they can't find elsewhere. But I want them to understand the difference between honorable violence and profitable violence, between fighting for principles and fighting for someone else's agenda. The motorcycle club community has largely recovered from the Rodriguez years. Conflicts still occur, but they tend to be smaller in scope and shorter in duration. Clubs have improved their security practices, become more suspicious of outside sources of intelligence, and developed better communication between leadership of different organizations. But the scars remain. Families destroyed by unnecessary violence, promising young prospects killed in manufactured wars, old-timers who lost faith in the brotherhood they'd served for decades. Rodriguez may be gone, but the damage he inflicted continues to affect people who trusted the wrong information, believed the wrong intelligence, and died for the wrong reasons. My name is Jake Sullivan, former Hells Angel, former prospect, former believer in the mythology of outlaw brotherhood. I spent 12 years in a world where loyalty was the highest virtue and violence was an acceptable tool for solving problems. I learned that both can be weaponized by people who understand how to exploit honor for dishonorable purposes. Tommy Rodriguez orchestrated the American biker wars not because he believed in any particular club or cause, but because chaos was profitable and honor was purchasable. He turned our greatest strengths against us, using our loyalty to betray us, using our brotherhood to isolate us, using our violence to destroy us. The real tragedy isn't that Rodriguez manipulated the outlaw motorcycle community, but that we made it so easy for him. We were so focused on external threats that we ignored internal vulnerabilities, so committed to our own mythology that we couldn't see how it was being used against us. This is my confession, my testimony, my warning to anyone who thinks their organization, their community, their brotherhood is immune to manipulation. Trust is necessary for any group to function, but blind trust is a weapon that can be turned against you by people who understand your weaknesses better than you understand your strengths. The wars are over, but the lessons remain. Honor without wisdom is dangerous. Loyalty without accountability is exploitable, and violence without purpose serves only those who profit from destruction. Remember, Danny, remember all the prospects and veterans who died fighting shadow enemies in Rodriguez's manufactured wars. Remember that the greatest threats often come not from obvious enemies, but from hidden manipulators who profit from turning allies against each other. The road goes on, but choose your battles carefully. Make sure you're fighting for something real, something worthy of the blood that will inevitably be spilled. And always remember that the man behind the curtain pulling the strings might not be who you think he is.